Well, greetings, everybody. Once again, this is your favorite speaker. It's Dr. Ronald J. Brown. And our topic for today is going to be another very future-looking topic, and that is going to be epidemics and pandemics in the 21st century. As you can see from the picture on the right, when I was in Mexico, during the worst time of COVID-19, Mexico was still open, but I wore a mask, except when I was out there visiting some of the ancient Maya ruins down in the Yucatan. So our topic, epidemics and pandemics, is very real. We're just getting over COVID-19, and everybody is asking, did we learn anything? So that we'll be better prepared in the future when the next pandemic or epidemic sweeps the world. And this is not something that is just relegated to the jungles of Africa or Brazil. This is very much a United States issue. In fact, the United States dealt with COVID-19 probably worse than most of the countries on the world. Between 1 million and 2 million died from COVID, a big disease outbreak. But we're going to be looking forward into the 21st century, so get ready for the next epidemic and pandemic, and the third millennium. I mean, we could very much face another mass die-off as they had during the bubonic plague, when up to a half of all the people in Europe and the Middle East died. Can you imagine New York losing 50% of its population? Well, my family in the deep South and the Midwest would probably not cry crocodile tears, but since I live in New York City, it would be something important for me. I just hope that I won't be among the casualties. So let's get going. First, our outline is disease, how people have traditionally looked at diseases. Secondly, how Americans view disease, and the belief or the myth that all diseases can be conquered, modern science will solve everything. How movies from Hollywood and elsewhere view epidemics and pandemics. Sometimes movies can be a little bit more insightful than all of the interviews with Fauci and doctors and politicians. Pandemics today and pandemics in the future. So let's get started on our topic for today. Well, COVID, until just recently, was very much in the news. Picture on the left shows me at my hostelito in the Mexican part of Cancun, where a whole gang of people were literally stranded during the worst days of COVID-19. Mexico was still open, but there were Australians who couldn't get home, Canadians who couldn't get home, Americans who were afraid to go home. And so they were all stranded there. And just above my head, you see there's a little balcony up there. And every day there would be people sitting there with their laptops. Some were teaching English. One woman was teaching Russian. Another guy was buying and selling coins from around the world. And they were staying at this little hostel in Cancun. In the middle shows me in front of the Elmhurst Hospital. Elmhurst Hospital was, unfortunately, ground zero for COVID-19 in New York City. More people died here than in any other hospital in New York, possibly even the world. And the controversy. See the size sticker. The COVID vaccine is not safe or effective. Resistance to taking the COVID vaccine, but even resistance in wearing masks and resistance in closing churches and schools and other places of education, entertainment, and whatnot. So this is the immediate background. This is why COVIDs and pandemics are so much still in the news. Well, historically, how have humans viewed disease? Well, when you go back to the Jewish Bible, You see, disease was a sign of the wrath of God. When Moses wanted the Hebrew people to get freed from Egypt, well, he put all kinds of plagues, the famous 10 plagues. Well, in addition to frogs and gnats and flies and thunderstorm and locusts and darkness and all that kind of stuff, disease was killing off the sheep, camels, cattle, which are very important for any ancient society, and humans were being afflicted with boils. And so disease was viewed as one of the ways that God punishes evil doers. So until today, I mean, many people, when they get sick, they get religious. They say, why is God punishing me? And they have this ancient biblical approach, which is not just in the Hebrew Bible, but in books such as the ancient Babylonians, Assyrians. Disease was a sign of an angry God, mainly because they couldn't do much about it. I mean, if you were coming down with boils or any other disease, in ancient times, they didn't have penicillin, they didn't know about germs, and they didn't know about cleanliness. And so they were very much at the mercy of a disease. So may as well blame it on God. In the book of Deuteronomy also says, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord our God, to observe all these things, God will set you on high above all the nations of the world. This is the Jewish dream of dominating the world, deeply rooted in Deuteronomy. But if you do not listen to the voice of God, well, curses will overtake thee, pestilence will cleave unto thee, wasting diseases, fevers, inflammation, fiery heat, and with drought. So all the forces of disease, the forces of nature, would punish those who didn't hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God. Jesus was obsessed with disease. Famous Bethesda fountain in Jerusalem, where Hebrews believed that the angel would come down, and when its wing touched the water at the Bethesda fountain, the first person in the water would be healed. Jesus curing the leper, curing diseases, paralyzed people get up and walk. So here again, this was a religious approach to disease, that the cure could only come from a god or an angel or a spirit. In fact, all the ancient religions had a god or a spirit or a ghost or something whose job was to overcome disease. The bubonic plague, the great Black Death from the 13 to 1400s, 1/3 of all the humans in Europe were believed to have died, some 50 million. Well, other people say that it was up to half of the population, and not just of Europe, but of North Africa, the Middle East. These were the great bubonic plague episodes. Well, even that has deeply influenced our approach to disease. The little ditty, ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Well, it was believed in the bubonic plague that flower petals could protect you. So put your pocket full of posies. Ashes would protect you from it. But then even it says, we all fall down anyways. The European languages were influenced by the bubonic plague. That's why we say, God bless you. When you sneeze, what do you need God's blessing if you're sneezing for? Well, because uncontrollable sneezing was viewed as one of the first symptoms of catching the bubonic plague. German, you say Gesundheit. French, santé. Arabic and Russian and the other European languages all have their equivalent of asking God to protect you from disease. Well, evidently it wasn't very effective, because if a third to a half of all the population of the Europe and Middle East died, evidently these blessings didn't work. But still, hope springs eternal, and we still say, God bless you. We didn't understand back then where diseases came from. One of the beliefs was bad air. This is called the miasma theory. I had a little bird. Its name was Enza. I opened up the window, and influenza, believing that influenza, malaria were caused by bad air. That's where the name malaria comes from. Mal, bad, air. So even until today, many people argue against sleeping with the windows open because they didn't understand what caused disease. Disease continued in the 14th century in Dante's Inferno. Disease was God's worst punishment for counterfeiters and people who bore false witness. So even in hell, disease was considered one of the most terrible punishments that Dante could imagine. The Black Death was followed by other pandemics: flu, cholera, influenza, malaria, yellow fever. These would sweep across countries, taking down millions. And people didn't understand where cancer came from: tuberculosis, mumps, measles, polio. They didn't know about germs. They didn't know about cleanliness. They didn't know about cleaning up the sewers and drinking fresh water. And so, of course, it was a terrible, evil creature that would go through, as you see in the Petit Journal, with its scythe, taking down millions of people. Well, Europe was plagued by this idea of disease. On the pictures on the right and in the middle, you see beautiful mosaics in churches. But if you look closely, you'll see that all of these mosaics are made out of human bones. They would bury the millions of people who died in the plague, and when the flesh had rotted, they would take out the bones, and they would use them to make chandeliers, decorations on the ceiling, wall decorations. Look at the cross. It's all human skulls. And so disease was linked to God as punishment. People didn't understand that rats carried diseases, that bad water could carry diseases. They didn't understand about germs. And so everything was related to God. In Mexico, the whole belief in the inevitability of death, of mass killing, of mass die-offs is a central feature of the Mexican version of what we call Halloween in the United States, the Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. Well, Mexicans had been plagued by death and disease since time immemorial. In fact, under the ancient Aztecs and Mayas, death was considered a passage to new life. It was necessary for people to die so that the sun would continue rising, and diseases were interpreted as the wrath of God. Spanish invaded. Half of the population of Mexico died from diseases that the Mexicans had no resistance to. So in the art of the Mexicans, such as the picture at the right, you see that the dead are still alive. They're mingling with the real people. And on the Day of the Dead, Mexicans go to the cemeteries where they believe that the spirits of their dead ancestors come back. And God forbid that you should go to the tomb of Uncle George, or Uncle Jorge, I should say, and you don't take him his traditional bottle of tequila and his good cigar, because if he is angry, his spirit is going to persecute you for the rest of your life. So death was linked with religion, with God, with spirits, with an angry God. Well, the United States wasn't so obsessed with death, although the bubonic plague still influences Americans by saying, God bless you. But the Americans had quite a different approach to religion, to diseases. Of course, we have the general studies of religion, Encyclopedia of Plague and Pestilence, an American plague, the yellow fever epidemic of 1793. Americans have always been plagued, just like their European counterparts, with death, and not just European, but mass die-offs in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. So the Americans inherited this very religious approach to disease from their ancestors in Europe, from their ancestors in Africa or Asia. It was somehow associated with religion, with an angry God. New York had its share of pestilence. We see the tuberculosis sanitarium, smallpox hospital on Roosevelt Island, which existed from just before the Civil War until the 1950s, when people dying of tuberculosis and smallpox and other diseases were sent to an island where they were isolated, because until the invention of penicillin and other diseases, nothing could be done about these. Tuberculosis was sometimes called consumption because it gradually consumed your body, and over a long period of time, you just got more and more debilitated. It was called the White Death. It didn't kill you quickly. It killed you over a long period of time, and nothing could be done about it. New Orleans is probably the most disease-plagued city in the United States because New Orleans lies below sea level. So the water sits, it does not drain out. So the great yellow fever epidemics, leprosy, were rampant in New Orleans. In fact, during the summer, thousands of people would die. Plus, it was a city that was constantly being flooded. So every time there'd be a big flood from the Mississippi, the mosquitoes would multiply. Anne Rice, who just passed away not too long ago, wrote a lot of books on New Orleans, where death, dying, and life just merged into a constant, ongoing battle. Her books, Interview with a Vampire, The Vampire Lestat, Queen of the Damned, The Tale of the Body Thief, and many others go into this rather morbid culture of New Orleans, a city plagued until today by death. Well, if you lived in New Orleans and spring was coming, summer was coming, mosquitoes, it'd be the yellow fever, death, or cholera, or who knew what. The holiday of Mardi Gras, or what we call Fat Tuesday, became one of the most important celebrations in New Orleans. Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, preceded Ash Wednesday, when Catholics went to the church and they got ashes on their forehead with a reminder, from ashes you came, until death will you go. Ashes to ashes. Well, if you're going into this period of Ash Wednesday and Lent leading up to the day on Good Friday of the death of Jesus. Well, on Tuesday, you went wild with celebration. I'm still alive. I survived another year. I survived another hot, humid summer in New Orleans. So you celebrated food, sex, everything imaginable, fancy costumes. Celebrate the fact that you're still alive. Well, New Orleans was constantly plagued. Another book, the 1878 yellow fever epidemic in Mississippi. Movies such as Plague Town made New Orleans the worst city in the United States as far as diseases were concerned. When the American government, federal government, opened its immigration center in 1892, transforming Bedloe's Island into an immigration center, one of the reasons was so many European immigrants were coming over who had smallpox, cholera, yellow fever, or many other contagious diseases, gonorrhea, syphilis, tuberculosis, you name it, they were bringing it with them. And so the immigrants were taken to Ellis Island, where they were inspected, and those who had any disease, trachoma in the eyes, they were rejected, sent back. Many of them just committed suicide when they knew they would never be able to come into the United States. So hopefully their wife or husband and their kids would be allowed in spite of the fact that one of their parents had a uncurable disease. In New York, famous Typhoid Mary. In the late 1800s up to 1938, she was a woman who had typhoid fever, but it was not symptomatic, meaning she didn't know she had it. The doctors found out she had it, and she was communicating it to probably hundreds of people. But the government could do nothing about it because they couldn't arrest her. She wasn't killing people. And so they tried to isolate her or to convince her not to be in contact with people, but she was a cook. She worked in restaurants, passing the disease on to other people. The Great Flu pandemic of 1920 swept around the world. 700,000, an estimate, died in the United States. Look at the hospital wards in the middle picture. 20 to 50 million people died. Well, we don't know how many people died. This was because in many cases, someone would die in a small town. The doctors didn't know what it was. They say he had a heart attack and bury him. Same thing happened with COVID. What caused somebody's death is very often open to interpretation. You have a heart attack. Well, if you have COVID in your blood, did COVID cause your death? Did it provoke the heart attack? What should they put on the death certificate? Heart attack or COVID? So this was probably the most recent horrendous pandemic that swept the world. In the 1929 and 30, there was another pandemic scare, and this was the Great Parrot Pandemic, where birds and house pets started dropping dead. Nobody knew what was causing it, but it was the Great Parrot Pandemic. People would kill their parrots. In the South, where they would be living in nature, they would hunt them down and kill them. But nobody knew what caused it as late as 1929 and 30. In the 1950s, the Great Polio Epidemic. This was spreading across the country with kids catching the disease and being in an iron lung because their lungs could no longer function. This was a horrendous disease, And of course, nobody got polio shots because nobody knew what caused the disease as recently as 1952. In fact, one of the most famous cases of polio was FDR, our president. And it was very rare to see him in a wheelchair because he didn't want to appear to be incapacitated. And so you'd see him getting out of a car, somebody helping him. He was always standing behind a podium, holding on because his legs were so weak. Well, the 1952 polio epidemic, there were over almost 58,000 cases. Over 3,000 died. But the worst was the thousands who were left with varying degrees of disability and paralysis. Once again, there was no cure for it. People prayed, they hoped they would eat healthily, they would avoid contact, but there was very little that anybody could do about it. Well, you want to take a quick break? This is the time to do it. To grab a glass of wine or something to eat so you can just press on mute and then continue. Well, in the United States, we just didn't idly accept the notion that disease was punishment from God. Americans started seriously asking what causes disease. Just as technology was advancing, just as society was advancing, people were getting more and more concerned about health. People started investigating what really caused the disease. They still may have said a prayer when they got sick, but they were also very interested in what caused diseases. The first public hospital in New York was Bellevue in 1736. Well, this was quickly followed by the hospitals being built by various immigrant groups. St. Vincent's Catholic Hospital was the Irish hospital just before the Civil War. The German hospital today, the Lenox Hill Hospital, same time. The Gouverneur Public Hospital, 1885, Harlem Public, 1887, Fordham Public, 1892. So people started building hospitals where doctors would be trained. You had your first medical schools where they were training doctors and nurses in how to deal with the various diseases and pandemics. Well, it was an uphill battle because it took a long time before penicillin and other things would be developed. And public health was a major issue in the major cities. In fact, in New York, it was illegal to kill pigs. Pigs roamed the streets of New York because pigs, as we know, will eat most anything. So table scraps, even human waste, dead animals would be left in the streets and the pigs would come up and devour them. Well, this was a scientific approach because everybody realized that if there was garbage all over the place, the city was going to be overrun by rats. And so pigs roamed free. They were allowed to eat everything and anything. Nobody could touch them. Pigs would even go after a rat and kill it. So there was an awareness that public health was an issue, especially when you started having millions of people crammed into tenements, into cities like New York, Berlin, Paris, London, Chicago. People started becoming more and more aware of public health. This is a very famous picture, which is hanging in the New York Historical Society, showing the most dangerous, congested area in New York City. This is today in modern-day Chinatown, and it shows 5 streets coming together. It was called 5 Points. This was painted in 1827. Well, most people don't look carefully at the painting, but if you look at the bottom on the left-hand side, you see a woman throwing out her garbage, and a pig comes running to eat everything. This was the way the city was kept clean. Well, gradually people realized that fresh water was a big issue. New York, Manhattan, is built on a big stone. It's an island. And there were very few little creeks that had fresh water. It was the stones. It was very difficult to dig wells, except in certain areas. And people realized that dirty water was a major cause for disease. So beginning in 1842, New York City and State built the famous Croton Reservoir system. On the right, you see the map, those green areas, Croton Watershed and the Catskill Delaware Watershed. Those were areas where people weren't allowed to live. They were filled with lakes and ponds and hills. And the water was captured, and in huge tunnels, it was brought down along the Hudson River to New York City. And it was stored in the famous Croton Reservoir, which you see in the picture at the bottom. That was at 42nd Street and 5th Avenue. That was a giant building where the fresh water was kept inside. It was open at the top, filled with water, and from there, water was sent in pipes to people's homes, to pumps outside people's buildings. So gradually, by the 1800s, people started wondering what causes disease and how can we improve the health. Not only the reservoir system was built, but people started paving the streets so that they were made of stone and you didn't have puddles of water, which would attract mosquitoes. Garbage disposal. Gradually, you started having wagons which would go around and pick up dead animals and garbage. People started taking baths more often than they did. In fact, many people thought it was unhealthy to take a bath more than once a year or once a month. People started wondering if something could be done to overcome some of these diseases. People started saying, maybe we can do something, invent some product that would protect us from diseases. They started thinking about the first vaccines. Here we see the New York City sewer system, and in some of the huge tunnels which we see under the ground for storm water and for sewer water. Now, of course, back in the 1840s and 50s, all this dirty water was simply pumped into the East River or the Hudson River, which made the rivers terribly polluted, but at least there was less water wandering around the city and causing pollution. There was less garbage being piled up on the streets, even though the pigs couldn't handle it. And so they started having wagons going around picking up some of this garbage. In 1853, they started building Central Park. Frederick Law Olmsted, who was the creator of Central Park, called it the lungs of the city because he believed that breathing fresh air, which is around trees and flowers and plants, that this was sanitary. It was healthy to breathe good air. Now, don't forget, back then, the heating in people's homes, cooking was done over wood fires or coal fires. So the city was covered with coal dust from the smoke of the fires. And so gradually people started saying that bad air is causing these diseases and that the air can be improved, just like the drinking water can be improved. So people stopped blaming everything on God and started saying maybe we are responsible for these pandemics and epidemics that sweep through the city and the country and the world periodically. People like Lillian Wald started organizing settlement houses where women were taught how to be nurses. Pregnant women were taught how to care for themselves. Immigrant women who came from farms in Eastern Europe were taught how to live in the city, how to wash foods before they eat them, how to recognize sour milk or milk that was diluted with dirty water, how to preserve meat, basically how to live in an apartment where you have to go outside and buy your food. As long as you were living on a farm, you had the chickens out there and you knew the eggs were fresh. You killed an animal, you knew how to preserve the meat and how to keep it clean. But living in the city, crammed into an apartment, you had to learn how to live in the cities. So it was a major, major problem for all these people living in the cities. Well, a lot of progress is made in all aspects of life when there is a war. When there's a war, people get inventive. In World War I, they invented the first airplanes, machine guns were made popular, all kinds of bombs, poison gas, all kinds of instruments of war were fast-tracked to development. Well, a guy from Scotland named Alexander Fleming, he realized that a lot of soldiers would be wounded, and they died not because of their wound, but they died because the wound got infected. And so he started studying what causes infections, what causes these people to die, realizing it wasn't God punishing them, but there was another cause. And so he started finding a product that could possibly destroy the infection. Well, first, of course, he said doctors and nurses should wash their hands when they go from one patient to the other. They should use clean bandages. They should boil the bandages so that they can kill any germs. So they started realizing that these diseases were being caused by germs. Germs are little tiny animals that you can't even see. They're floating through the air. They pass from person to person. So penicillin gradually, over a period of a good number of years, was invented, and it is attributed to Alexander Fleming, who by the end of the war and into the 1920s had discovered the first antibiotic to fight off infections. Now, this was very important because so many soldiers died not of the wound, but of the infection. There was an operation, the wound would get infected. In 1938, Jonas Salk invented a flu and influenza vaccine, arguing that God had nothing to do with disease, but it was caused by infections. So by the 1940s, penicillin use was widespread. Polio vaccine was invented in 1952. And other diseases were being studied. What caused them? Well, of course, that involved a lot of technology. Various microscopes to isolate the little bugs and germs and microbes that were causing these diseases. Various ways of antiseptic, cleaning, various cleaning products were invented. So it was the scientific approach to conquering diseases. The polio vaccine by Jonas Salk was considered a revolution. And it began in the 1950s, the mass polio vaccination. In fact, I remember as a kid getting the polio shot in your arm. Schools would be totally vaccinated. And so polio, which had completely incapacitated so many people like FDR, was gradually becoming a disease of the past. Well, this so inspired scientists that they started actually believing that any disease could be conquered, that human science and technology was going to solve all diseases. So this was a very optimistic period following World War II, both in the United States and Europe and around the world. The scientists will cure it. Don't worry. Well, the worry of diseases still remained powerful. In the movies, the horror movies about diseases still remained a very popular genre. People remember the bubonic plague, the great pandemics which spread during World War I, the Spanish flu pandemic. Diseases were constantly emerging from the jungles of Africa and Brazil that nobody could understand. And so science was making great progress, but people were still fascinated by disease. In the plague epidemic in New Orleans, 1950, in the famous film Panic in the Streets by the great cineasta Elias Kazan, where thousands of people still continued to die. Well, government realized that disease was still a powerful force in our world. And during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, biological warfare was researched because both countries eventually had the atomic bomb, and it was believed that manufacturing some type of a deadly disease that could be put into a rocket and dumped in the water supply or in the air could be more effective than the atomic bomb in killing off millions of people. And so governments around the world were doing massive amount of research in developing new bugs, new pandemics to hopefully wipe out the enemy. Fascinating movie called The Crazies, 1973, highlighted the release of a military biological weapon on inhabitants of a small American town. Once again, this is a George Romero film, and it shows how this disease, this germ, could drive people crazy. Still, the memory of a mass die-off remained powerful and captivated people. Disease films such as The Virus, where East German mad scientists and American spies end up releasing a virus that killed everybody on Earth except 863. So it makes you wonder why these movies continue to captivate people. It's this fear that disease will somehow destroy humanity. And don't forget, as I'm speaking, with American high technology, great scientific research, research universities, still between 1 million and 2 million Americans died of COVID-19, which convinced Americans that, yes, disease, pandemics, epidemics are still very much part of the American experience. Walking Dead, 2010, comic book series, TV series, once again showing how a pandemic can turn people into zombies. Here again, the fear of a germ sweeping across the world. Andromeda Strain, fascinating movie, where you see a germ taking over the earth and killing millions of people. In fact, there was a big disease fear when Yuri Gagarin came back from space and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon in 1969. There were a lot of people who opposed a moon landing because they were afraid that some germ from the moon or some other planet would be brought back and it would wipe out the entire human race. So as science was making progress in developing artificial hips, discovering what caused cancer, developing new tests for gonorrhea, for syphilis, for prostate cancer, still this horrendous fear of mass die-off continues to fascinate people. Cronenberg's film Shivers, also known as A Parasite Murders, where a mad doctor infects his girlfriend, where people, because of this parasite, are turned into mindless, sex-craved fiends. Here again, 1975, and the fear of a mass die-off continues to plague human nature. One of my favorites is The Island of Dr. Moreau, originally 1977, and then a new version, 1996, with Marlon Brando and Val Kilmer. This is an H.G. Wells film. He highlights a very interesting aspect, and that is that we always think of university research labs coming up with disease, cures for disease, or we think of the American government funding research, or we think of an American government coming up with some type of biological warfare. But the movies like The Island of Dr. Moreau, they highlight the fact that sometimes it is the mad scientist who is not limited by any altruistic or lofty ideas, who could at any time develop some type of a new disease. And with COVID-19, many people still suspect that it was some Chinese researchers developing some kind of a biological warfare germ that actually gave birth to COVID-19. So this is a very important aspect of biological warfare, germ warfare, that it's not just scientists and governments who have access to this, but some mad scientist on an island off somewhere could very much today be developing the next germ which will sweep across the earth. Another great film in this genre is World War Z with Brad Pitt. Once again, where you see a germ going around the world, killing off the bulk of human population. Well, pandemics today are still with us. in spite of penicillin and all of the scientific and medical progress, people still, deep down in their souls, fear another global pandemic. In fact, as the genre of film shows that we just saw, it remains a captivating idea for humans. The idea, the fear of a massive die-off. Well, as we move into the 21st century, Mark Honigsbaum called it the pandemic century. As I speak, over half of the human population lives in mega cities. The New York mega area, some 20 million people. Tokyo, 30 million people. I believe Tokyo is the largest city in the world. Shanghai, cities in Rio, where you have giant slums surrounding the city. People living in apartments with very little ventilation. It would be very easy for another disease to take root in a rough neighborhood somewhere and mutate and spread around the world. AIDS was one such plague, and we saw with the AIDS epidemic how governments really failed to respond. Most politicians and especially religious leaders didn't take it seriously. Some religious leaders even called it, once again, punishment by God on the gay, lesbian population. Here again, you think you were back in the Middle Ages or back in the Jewish Old Testament times, blaming such things on God. But here again, this idea that in spite of our modern science, God still has something to do with it, came up very strong during the AIDS epidemic. New books are constantly being written, whether it's a pandemic century, saying get ready, it's only going to get worse, and other books such as Epidemics and Plagues. We all know about AIDS, but Ebola, Asian flu, Zika, SARS, dengue fever, once again, are ever-present threats to the very existence of humanity. Well, some people respond positively when there is a challenge, such as the gay men's health crisis of 1982, rejected the argument given by a lot of preachers and priests and rabbis that this was God's punishment. Many people said, no, it is not God's curse on a homosexual lifestyle. It is a disease. And like every other disease, a cause can be found, vaccine can be discovered, and humans have the capacity to deal with diseases. But yet, we saw with the AIDS crisis, this deep division. Politicians refused to take it seriously for a very long time. Religious leaders came down on both sides. Even families would blame God as bringing down this plague on sexually marginalized people. In fact, many people call the AIDS epidemic a second Holocaust because so many millions of people died. Other people said it was caused by the CIA or the US government. So here again, in our modern world, in our modern age, we are still going back to the Old Testament times, to the times of ancient history, when disease was a punishment from God. And diseases are getting worse. We not only are now using penicillin, but we are overusing penicillin. And as we saw with COVID, it is constantly mutating. It is responding to everything we can throw at it. We now have antibiotic-resistant gonorrhea, syphilis, all kinds of other diseases that all of our antibiotics are no longer able to deal with them. And this is becoming a major issue. Even animals that we have so carefully pumped full of antibiotics, and then we eat the meat. And so people no longer are resistant to a lot of these diseases. Every Ebola outbreak risks spreading around the world and killing millions of people. Zika virus, constant problem, outbreaks in Africa that scientists can barely keep control. But in today's world, with everybody flying in jets around the world, going on vacation in this place or the other place, it is almost impossible to control even a small outbreak in some place, possible to keep it from spreading. The coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic, which was a real experiment in how the world responds today to a pandemic, where countries like the United States handle it very poorly and millions of people die. Other countries like Brazil, massive death. Should we wear masks? What are the politicians saying? Which religious leaders say, don't wear a mask, continue to go to church or school or synagogue, that God will protect you? Well, we survived the coronavirus of beginning February 2020, and we have developed masks. We have developed all kinds of protections against it. Plus, the COVID-19 has mutated to such an extent that now it is widespread, but it is much less lethal than the previous viruses. Well, that also means that it could continue mutating, and we could wake up tomorrow and find out that a brand new mutation has emerged and it is spreading like wildfire in the airplanes and in the schools and in the office buildings and in the subways of the world. So here again, how much did we learn from COVID-19? Where the rich countries of Europe, United States, and Japan hoarded the vaccines and the drugs while they let the poor country populations die off. We don't know, and we don't want to know, how many people in Africa or the rural parts of India died. We don't want to know. Governments did not cooperate. There was every country for itself. And who knows what is going to be with the next pandemic. Then there was monkeypox. Well, monkeypox, which we're not supposed to call monkeypox anymore. I forget what the new name is. But here again, it emerged because of human contact with animals. I was at Fire Island at a party when a bunch of nurses arrived on a motorboat, and they had monkeypox vaccine. And they started vaccinating for the first shot everybody who was at the disco. So we just stood in line and we got our first shot, and later I got my second shot. And it didn't spread very far, and it was eventually controlled. But here again, who knows what the situation is going to be with the next pandemic? It might be even more difficult to develop a vaccine. The vaccine might be restricted to very few people, and politicians will restrict its use to the rich countries. So what is going to be in the future? Once again, the four horsemen of the apocalypse in the book of Revelation in the Christian Bible include war, famine, conquest, and pestilence. The pale horse is the symbol of plague and infectious diseases. These are going to mark the end of the age. The world will come to an end through world wars, famine, conquest, and disease. So the Christian Bible, like the Jewish Bible and every other religious body, still preach the threat of pestilence and disease. And books like the book of Revelation and Deuteronomy and the Jewish Bible and even Genesis still highlight the role of pestilence. And so, in spite of all of our modern science, people are still terrified by the realization that diseases are still here and just might get worse. The Mayan calendar, which predicts the end of the world in 2043, once again highlights that when the world comes to an end, there will be epidemics and plagues, and then famine. Governments will be lost to foreigners, war, wise men and prophets will die, total collapse of everything. This is the Maya prophecy. In fact, that's me at Palenque, one of the big Maya cities. And it's a great place to think about the Maya calendar and their prophecies because this was an ancient city built of stone with temples and tens of thousands of people, which was suddenly emptied. Until today, people don't know why the entire population just up and left. Did they die? Was it a mass migration? Did they believe that the end of the world was approaching? Nothing better to do than to walk through in a totally abandoned city like this and contemplate what the end times will bring. Well, science still remains optimistic. While there are many politicians and religious leaders who expect massive die-offs and believe that humans can do nothing to stop the next big die-off, there are still many scientists and many rational people who believe that we will be lucky and find a cure. Hope springs eternal. Doctors and scientists are constantly inventing new ways of dealing with diseases. We came with a cure, or at least making AIDS livable, not killing off millions of people. COVID is now under control. Monkeypox was controlled. Polio is under control. And so scientists still remain optimistic. The book by Jesse Canon, The End of All Disease, simple, little known and proven cures for 7 of the most dangerous diseases. So people are optimistic. In fact, somebody like Ray Kurzweil says that gradually disease will no longer be an important point because we will liberate ourselves from the human body and we will live in computers and we will live in a memory stick where we won't need this, what one scientist called bag of water and protein. And this is called transhumanism. Great movie, Transcendence, where we are liberated from this human body. We transcend biology, as Ray Kurzweil writes. He calls this singularity when we are finally liberated from the human body. I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime, but as we get more and more scientific advances, we could end up getting rid of the human body and just living in a robot, having our intelligence uploaded to a robot, and we would have no problems. Maybe rust would bother us unless it's made out of plastic, but we wouldn't have to go around worrying about germs anymore. So I am optimistic. Hopefully, we have learned something from pandemic, COVID, AIDS, everything else. Hopefully, we will be able to adapt to the new world, and humanity will live well into the 21st century and for another 1,000 years. So I'm an optimist. So whenever there is a shot, I get it. I get a flu shot every year. I got my 2 monkey shots. I got all of my shots for COVID. So the next time a disease comes up, kangaroo pox or whatever it is, I will trust in Mr. Fauci and modern science. So thank you, everybody, for joining me. It's been a great pleasure, as is usual, and I hope to see you sometime in the future for another exciting lecture by your favorite speaker, Ronald Brown. So have a good day. Bye-bye.